I want to tell the human evolution story from an African perspective. I'm an African. Well, I'm a South African. I'm half an Afrikaner, which means African. I'm embedded in Africa. The African perspective is radically different from the background to the conventional story told by evolutionary biologists. I'm not one of them. I'm a land surveyor. Much of this material may be familiar. The African story just includes more animals as actors than the conventional origin story does. It tells that humans didn't so much evolve as evolution happened to them, thanks to a community of other African actors. When I asked Google to tell me the ascent of man, it gave me these pictures of steadily increasing and accelerating brain size. These hardly need a story to explain their meaning. Brain size goes with intelligence. Intelligence is obviously useful. Humans are just lucky to have evolved to be so intelligent, a bit ahead of the other apes. From Darwin's day until the end of the 20th century, successive fossil discoveries did support that story of steadily accelerating progress in brain size pretty well. But in 2003, the discovery of late surviving small-brained forest hobbits in Indonesia challenged that story. And in 2013, Homo naledi found near Johannesburg made it even worse. If an unstructured trend in brain size doesn't fit its actual evolution, what would be better? In 2021, a team led by Professor De Silva produced this graph of human brain size changes using a much bigger fossil dataset. They used software that automatically fitted a chain of linear trend lines. They want to study a radical decrease in brain size over just the last 3,000 years. But their graph also shows a breakpoint about 2.3 million years ago, from gradual to steep. They weren't sure whether to include Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis. Including them or leaving them out had little effect on what they were interested in. But notice that those so-called outliers would fit the earlier line of slow brain growth if we extended it past that breakpoint. The De Silva graph used a log scale for brain size, but this simple linear graph of brain volume against time shows the same breakpoint between an 18 million year long period of slow brain growth that went right past Homo floresiensis and a 20 times faster so-called encephalization that started near Australopithecus africanus and lasted 2 million years. The blue points are averages for species whose brain sizes were themselves increasing over their lifespans. This kind of branching, where a new stem breaks off from an existing one, is well known in principle as punctuated equilibrium. If you just rotate this pic from Wikimedia so that time increases to the right, you get this. What sense can we make of this structure? It shows that human brains grew under two natural selection regimes, a flatlining one and a shorter period of constant and much quicker growth. That looks like a hockey stick. A few hominins continued along the flat-lining path past the branch point. Let's call that a bone spur. Here's a useful cartoon of that simple story. But what do we mean by natural selection regime? Darwin described natural selection very succinctly when he contrasted it with sexual selection. Natural selection depends on a struggle for existence in relation to other organic beings or to external conditions. The result is death to the unsuccessful competitor. Why death? Is because the dead competitor won't produce offspring that carry his or her characteristics. But that death is also a meal for the killer. So Darwin's definition placed the actors in an ecological food web, the flow of energy through a set of actors originally coming from the sun. A useful term for such a regime is environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So the survival of the Flores hobbits and their ancestors going back 8 million years, including the pivotal Australopithecus, depended on a struggle for existence against one set of organic beings or external conditions. Let's call that EEA1. The survival of modern humans depended on a struggle against different organic beings or external conditions, EEA2. Let's use the pivotal Australopiths to understand this EEA1. They were first described in 1925 by Raymond Dart, an Australian professor at the New University of the Witwatersrand in the new mining town of Johannesburg, which was then in the wilds of Africa. He saw from where the skull had been attached to the spine that this town child had been bipedal, that it lacked the big canines of the apes. Quoting Darwin's remark that no country in the world abounds in a greater degree with dangerous beasts than southern Africa, he inferred that it must have used hand weapons for offense and defense. Later discoveries showed that the Australopiths have also lived in East Africa and had indeed been bipedal, with short-toed feet like ours, unlike what Darwin called the quadrumana, the four-handed apes. When Darwin remarked about the dangerous beasts in southern Africa, he was pointing out that they set a high standard of being both hard to kill and good at killing. Today, plant-eating hippo, elephant, and buffalo kill 5 times more humans than predators do when people get in their way. Those are accidents, but also predators need to treat big prey species as aggressive and dangerous. As shown from their molar teeth, and like baboons, Australopiths were plant eaters. They too had predators in the food web. One hominin skull has puncture marks showing that it was killed by a leopard. Leopards are also the bane of baboons because, unlike other large savanna predators, baboons can't escape from them by just climbing a tree. The town child fossil was delivered to Dart in a box together with baboon fossils from the same lime quarry, and baboons were found at 5 other hominin sites in South Africa. Apparently, 2 kinds of primates settled the savanna: arboreal monkeys and apes. The monkeys adapted into baboons with a dog body plan like many other mammals, but apes adapted into an utterly unique body plan. Baboons are a godsend for understanding the EO1 that Australopiths shared with them. If we can understand why baboons look like dogs, that can help us understand why the Australopiths had this unique body plan. Here's a real-life record of a struggle for existence between baboons and a leopard in the daytime.
Wow! Holy!
Although the consensus is that baboons evolved their big canines through sexual selection, they played a role in routing that leopard. If it had been hunting unarmed hominids instead, then they would not have been hard to kill. Dart's inference that they'd used hand weapons instead of biting like other primates is inescapable. But it isn't fully part of the consensus. This AI overview dates the evolution of hand weapons to almost modern Neanderthals, starting with clubs and other thrown weapons. Although this reference to stone, bone, and wood still echoes Dart's Latin term for an Australopith osteodonto-keratic culture. The fact is that hardly any attention has been given to the plausible form of early weapons. Suppose that clubs were the earliest weapons, like in these pics from a Google search. How could one even make clubs like these? And how useful would they have been? The African Nokiri is its most useful wooden form, and is deadly when aimed at the skull. It's also relatively easy to make from a bush or a tree. It needs just 3 cuts, plus a lot of scraping. A spear is even simpler to make. It needs only 2 cuts and a lot less scraping. Spears are the other plausible effective weapons, and their 2 kinds of use have importantly different effects. The throwing spear can strike distant prey that's trying to escape, and if it lodges in the body, further movement is so painful that it slows or stops the animal. That's useful in hunting. The thrusting spear has an opposite use. It can stop an attacker, keep it at a distance, and take the initiative from it. Unlike the throwing spear and a kerry, the thrusting spear is both a stopper and a striker. Before muskets and cannon became main weapons in European wars, groups of pikemen could stop charging cavalry. That shows the power of a thrusting spear to stop a heavier antagonist. And a phalanx of pikemen looks a bit like an African porcupine. This PBS video, use of a much-copied image, shows Australopiths behaving passively and uselessly in the face of a threat, only then looking around for any sticks on the ground. African animals have never been as useless as that, but when it comes to the tiny-brained Homo floresiensis, the consensus has no problem in seeing them using crafted spears. Although no wooden weapons have yet been found with them, the same lack of material evidence used to doubt whether the Australopiths made or used weapons. The tiny pom-pom crab holds one anemone in each claw, and it manages them intensely. When threatened, it pushes the stinging anemones at the threat. It trims the anemones and takes food from them, keeping them small. If it loses one anemone, it tears the other into two and attaches half to the other claw, where it regenerates. When it molts or when it wants to clean its front, it first attaches an anemone to one of its legs and later retrieves it. If it loses both anemones, it immediately tries to replace them. So this is an obligatory relationship. Those complex behaviors evolved with only the transmission of instincts and without any brain to speak of. And that habit affected its body plan so that its claws are only useful for holding anemones. Although baboons fight leopards while foraging in the day, at night they sleep in high trees where leopards hunt them openly, sometimes for several hours, while the baboons cling to terminal branches and only bark when that won't reveal their location. That makes sense because a leopard is agile in a tree, has better night eyesight, is heavier, and risks falling from the great height. The topology of the tree and the darkness prevents the baboons from concentrating against the leopard. Ocelopath's short toes would put them at a crippling disadvantage in that context, nor could individuals use weapons in the dark and amidst branches against antagonists they could hardly see. They wouldn't have been hard to kill if they roosted in trees. If they slept on the ground, they wouldn't have just needed to be safe from leopards, but also from other predators that couldn't climb trees. A closed-off, barricaded area would keep predators away, or, if they forced their way through, would reveal their position to those inside, who could concentrate because they had freedom of movement within the compound and could spear the predator before it emerged. If a predator did get in and secure a victim, it would be difficult to get out again carrying its prey. This Maasai settlement shows some of the costs of a barricaded refuge. The thorn boma seems mainly designed to protect cattle in kraals at the heart of the settlement. That suggests a still active competition between humans and lions for meat resources on the Masai Mara. If ocelopaths made barricaded refuges, maybe using unworked stones, that would have taken up much of their time. The bomas would have needed frequent maintenance, forcing them to travel further and further to find thornwood. Each troop would have been effectively tethered to their refuge for its lifetime. Around the time of the town child, there was an abrupt change in Darwin's other organic beings or external conditions that hominids struggled against. There was no dramatic change in the external conditions. Previously, the other organic beings had been their predators. Who were those new organic beings? The places where late surviving small-brained hominids who'd stayed under EEA1 were found might give a clue. Homo floresiensis were found on the eastern side of this Wallace Line. That is a deep water barrier that insulated Australasian fauna from almost all Eurasian mammals. Homo floresiensis crossed that barrier 200,000 years before large-brained hominids did, and the hobbits went extinct soon after that. The inference is that the hobbits were keeping out of the way of the humans. Other small-brained Homo naledi were found almost impossibly deep in two cave systems near Johannesburg. Like the Indonesian hobbits, they may have been also hiding from humans, and that their clever refuge became a fatal trap. A similar tragedy happened in 1854 when Chief Makapan was besieged with his tribe by a vengeful Boer commander and starved out in what's now called the Historic Cave in the Limpopo province. These events suggest that the other organic beings during EEA2 were other groups of hominids. By living in groups whose members depended on survival of the group and forming long-lived, precious, defended nests that need maintenance, the Australopiths would have met the two conditions that the Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson defined for the emergence of multi-level selection in a species, where individuals develop abilities that serve the survival of the group rather than themselves. A population of groups become the Darwinian units of selection. It's then the groups that evolve. Bees, ants, and termites are eusocial. Important terms we share with them, but not with other mammals, are queens, soldiers, workers, warfare, farming, self-sacrifice, raiding. Those terms are so important in our lives that we should treat this as an important clue to the human condition. Eusocial insects pioneered this living 100 million years before humanity, and they've been highly successful. Only 2% of insect species are eusocial, but they make up 75% of the insect biomass. Only one mammal species is eusocial to an equivalent degree, and with our livestock, humans make up 96% of the mammal biomass on Earth. Termite colonies evolve various castes like soldiers and workers through mysterious transmission of instincts. Humans evolved a less mysterious workaround to achieve the same specializations and more. Soldiers are trained and motivated through a tradition that's developed and passed down through generations using language. Scientists are mentored and motivated into different competencies, also using language. These mentoring systems are what the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins has called meme plexes, to emphasize the fact that society's host populations of competing and complementary idea systems expressed through language. Dawkins invented the term memes as a play on genes, the basic genetic building blocks, and he saw meme plexes as having been built up from them. But if complex competences were communicated from the start, that would explain why brain expansion started as long as 2 million years ago, long before speech. Consider the usefulness 2 million years ago of acting out the message, "Look what happened when I met a stranger from over there." Acting out is an effective information transmitter and motivator thanks to mirror neurons that fire when we watch something being done, as well as when we do it ourselves. Consider how you might be able to appreciate the basic message of the drama Macbeth, even if it were told in a language you didn't understand. So communication in humans may have originated in influential drama and evolved from there in terms of precision, economy, and reach through many steps. Gestures into signed words, word classes like nouns, verbs and their modifiers, syntax, and mouth adaptations for speech, and then writing. Language evolution might not be over yet, with the advent of AIs that embody mankind's textual competences, becoming the hive mind, or supporting totalitarian regimes like in George Orwell's Big Brother, or the surfacing of Carl Jung's collective unconscious. In this decade, we face how basically unpredictable this creative evolution is by us.